Hi, my name is Emily Carter, and this is my story. They say every family has secrets, but ours just had expectations. My parents built an empire, and my brother Ryan was always the golden boy. I was just the quiet daughter with a tiny job. For years, I listened to them laugh, and I swallowed the humiliation. I always believed that in the end, actions speak louder than words. But what happens when the perfect moment to prove them all wrong comes at the worst possible time? Will I finally find the courage to speak up? Or will I let my silence do the talking? Stick with me, because this story isn't just about business. It's about finding my voice. They say every family dinner has two things: expensive wine and silent judgments. That night ours had both, plus one loud humiliation. The chandeliers at the Monarch Hotel glimmered like liquid gold, reflecting on crystal glasses and polished egos. My brother Ryan raised his champagne, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. "My sister still has that tiny, pathetic job," he announced, grinning at 200 guests. "You know I'm still doing that." "What was it?" Online thing. Laughter rippled across the room. And just like that, I remembered what it felt like to be invisible in my own family. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration: Dad's 65th birthday, the Carter Legacy Dinner, as Mom called it. Everyone dressed like success. Ryan in his tailored navy suit, his fiancée Clara dripping diamonds like they were part of her skin, and Dad proud as ever, surrounded by old business partners. Then there was me, Emily Carter, age 30, sitting at the far end of the table beside the catering staff service door. My dress was simple, my hair pinned back. I hadn't said much all night. "Emily," Mom said, turning toward me with that polite smile she used for family photo ops. "How's your work going, sweetheart?" "Good," I said. "Busy, actually." "Busy?" Ryan interrupted, smirking. "She sells things online, Mom. Everyone's busy clicking buttons these days." Laughter again. Even Dad chuckled softly. Clara covered her mouth but didn't hide her grin. My fork paused over my plate. I wanted to say something, anything to defend myself, to tell them what I'd really been working on for the past 3 years. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I took a sip of water, feeling the cool slide of it against a throat that burned with restraint. Ryan leaned back, loving his spotlight. "You know, Em, you should think about a real career. Something respectable. Maybe at one of Dad's old firms. Reception work suits you. You've got that smile." A few guests whispered. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. My mother's expression faltered. "Ryan, no." Ryan waved her off. "I'm just saying, we all start somewhere, right?" He didn't notice how Dad's old business partner, Mr. Franklin, was checking his phone under the table, eyes widening slightly at something on the screen. He didn't notice the growing buzz from the bar area, a murmur moving like electricity through the crowd. And he certainly didn't notice when Franklin whispered something to his wife, then looked directly at me. "Wait a second," Franklin said, suddenly raising his voice. "Emily Carter?" Ryan frowned. "What about her?" Franklin blinked, his tone incredulous. "You're talking about Emily Carter, the one just named CEO of Nova Shares?" The room froze. Ryan laughed, confused. "What are you talking about?" Franklin turned his phone toward him. The headline was impossible to miss. "Nova Shares announces new CEO Emily Carter, the young visionary behind Carter Tech's stock surge." Someone gasped. Then someone else whispered, "Wait, Carter Tech? Isn't that the AI analytics firm that went public last quarter?" I set my glass down gently. The sound was soft, but it felt louder than Ryan's laughter ever had. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. That's a coincidence. Different Emily Carter." Mr. Franklin shook his head. "No coincidence. The article's got her photo." "You didn't know." All eyes turned to me. I met my brother's gaze, the smugness gone, replaced by confusion, disbelief, maybe even fear. "Yes," I said calmly. "That's me." Silence spread across the room like a storm cloud. Even the string quartet faltered mid-note. Ryan's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Clara whispered, "Oh my God." Dad's face was unreadable. Mom's hand covered her mouth, eyes wide and wet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Franklin chuckled softly. Well, I'll be damned. Guess the Carter legacy has a new chapter. Someone clapped. Then another. Within seconds, applause filled the room, awkward at first, then genuine. But I wasn't listening. My heartbeat was slow, steady. My hands were calm on the tablecloth. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, not the humiliation, but the silence that would follow it. The sound of realization. The sound of power shifting. Ryan stood frozen, his face pale under the chandeliers. You never told anyone, he muttered. I smiled. You never asked. Dad rose from his chair, his voice thick. Emily, is this true? Yes, I said simply. Nova shares went public last quarter. I founded it under a holding company, Carter Analytics, the same online thing you laughed about. The silence stretched again. This time, it didn't sting. It crowned me. Dad's eyes glistened. You built that, on your own, with a small team, I said softly. And a lot of late nights. Ryan's voice cracked again. You mean, you're a millionaire, Mr. Franklin corrected him gently. Try multimillionaire. Nova Shares' valuation crossed $1 billion this morning. Gasps again. My brother sat down hard, as if gravity had doubled. I looked at him not with anger anymore, but with something quieter. Pity, maybe, or understanding. The chandeliers shimmered, and I finally felt seen. For years I'd swallowed humiliation, worked in silence, endured every sneer and dismissal. And now I realized silence had been my strategy all along. I lifted my glass water, not champagne, and met Ryan's eyes. To the family I said evenly, may we always remember that small doesn't mean insignificant. The applause swelled again this time, like a wave I didn't need to ride because I'd already reached the shore. Outside, the night lights of the city gleamed against the glass, each one a reflection of what they never saw coming. And across the table, my brother, the one who had laughed the loudest, sat in silence. Exactly where I had been all those years ago. The next morning, I woke to the sound of headlines. Not the kind you scroll past while drinking coffee, but the kind that shifts the air around you. Meet Emily Carter, the silent force behind Nova Shares' billion-dollar rise. From receptionist to CEO, the hidden Carter who outsmarted Wall Street. My phone buzzed endlessly, emails, calls, interview requests. I ignored them all. My apartment was quiet, flooded with early sunlight. I let the stillness settle in, the echo of last night's shock, still vibrating faintly under my skin. Some part of me still saw Ryan's face, the disbelief, the instant crumble of arrogance. But the truth was that dinner had been years in the making. The humiliation wasn't new. It was just finally repaid. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where my old laptop still had a chipped corner and a fading sticker that read, "Keep building." It was from the days I worked as a receptionist in a midtown tech office, the kind of job people forget to respect until you disappear and come back owning the company they laughed about. A message popped up from my assistant, Claire. "Claire, you're trending. CNBC wants a live interview." "Do we accept it?" "Me, not yet. Let them talk first." I wasn't ready for cameras. Not because I was scared, but because silence had always been my weapon. People reveal more in silence than they ever do in speeches. My doorbell rang around 9. Through the peephole, I saw my mother, hair, immaculate face drawn tight in that way she always carried bad news gently. When I opened the door, she smiled awkwardly. "You look different this morning." "Coffee?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Please." We sat across from each other, the hum of the city below us like a steady metronome. She stirred her cup, even though I hadn't added sugar. "Your father barely slept," she said softly. "He's proud, but he's also confused. We didn't know, Emily. I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell us?" I exhaled. "Because every time I tried you, and Dad looked at me like I was wasting time. Remember when I said I was building an analytics platform for retail investors? Dad told me to focus on finding a husband first." Her eyes softened. "He didn't mean harm. I know, I said. He just didn't believe it. She looked around my apartment, simple, quiet, minimalist. You've done well. Better than they think, I said. Nova Shares isn't just mine. It's a platform for small investors, people who've been excluded from the system. We made stocks accessible, transparent. She nodded slowly, trying to keep up. And how much is it worth now? I almost smiled. Last valuation. About 1.2 billion. Her spoon clinked against the cup. Oh, Emily. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She reached for my hand, something she hadn't done in years. I'm sorry we didn't see you. I didn't need you to see me, I said quietly. I just needed you not to laugh. Her eyes shimmered. Your brother called. He wants to talk. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Now he does. He feels terrible. He feels embarrassed, I corrected. There's a difference. She didn't argue. She never did when I spoke like that. She'd always known that once my voice steadied, it was final. Before she left, she paused at the door. Your father's hosting Thanksgiving this year. He wants you to come. I'll think about it. I hope you do, she said softly. Maybe it's time to let them see the real you, not the headline. After she left, I turned back to my laptop. Claire had sent another message, Claire. Our stock just climbed 12% after the press leak. Board wants a statement. Me. Draft something simple. Gratitude. Clarity. No emotion. By noon, every major outlet had called. Bloomberg, Forbes, even the Wall Street Journal. I said no to all of them. Let the story breathe, I told myself. The longer the silence, the louder the impact. Around 2 p.m, my phone rang again. Ryan. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. Emily. He said, his voice small, unlike the booming one from last night. Hey, I don't even know where to start. Try with, I'm sorry. That's a classic. He sighed. I was an idiot. I didn't know. I didn't expect you to, I said calmly. You were too busy proving you were better. Come on, he said, trying for a laugh that didn't land. You can't tell me you didn't enjoy that little public reveal. I didn't plan it, Ryan. I didn't need to. You built that moment yourself. There was silence. Then quietly, you're right. I almost felt pity. Almost. He cleared his throat. Look, Dad wants to talk business. He thinks maybe we could... Stop. My tone was sharp enough to cut him off. Don't turn this into another deal. I'm just saying we could merge your companies doing incredible things and Dad still has... I laughed softly. Ryan. I'm not merging with the man who called me an embarrassment. Or his son who mocked me at his birthday dinner. He didn't respond. I could hear him breathing shallow and uneasy. Ryan, I said, my voice softening. Do you know what it's like to be underestimated for so long that you start using it as fuel? He didn't answer. That's what I did, I said. While you were networking in Dad's office, I was coding. While you were mocking my tiny job, I was building systems to make sure people like you never control everything again. Emily. I didn't mean, I know I interrupted. But now, you'll have to live with it. I ended the call. For a while, I sat there staring at the skyline. The city looked different now, less like a challenge, more like a mirror. By evening, the media storm had turned into a hurricane. Nova Shares' website crashed twice from traffic. My inbox overflowed with offers from investors, conferences, collaborations. I ignored them all. Around 7, I walked to the balcony with a glass of wine and let the autumn wind move through my hair. Below, the streets glowed like veins of light. My phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. Unknown impressive debut, Ms. Carter. The market noticed. So did we. Interested in discussing expansion attached was a signature Jonathan Pierce, CEO, Helios Capital. Helios. The same investment group that had once rejected my pitch 3 years ago, back when I was just another startup dreamer. I stared at the message. Power had an interesting way of circling back. I typed 3 words. Let's talk tomorrow. As the city lights shimmered, I thought of Dad, of Ryan, of the way Clara's smile had evaporated last night. For years they'd taught me to measure worth by visibility. But power, I'd learned, doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being underestimated long enough to become undeniable. The next day would bring new offers, new dangers, new alliances. But for now, I sat quietly letting the night hold its applause. Because revenge didn't always need noise. Sometimes it just needed time and the perfect silence after the fall. The first time I met Jonathan Pierce, I almost didn't recognize power. It wasn't loud. It didn't brag. It smiled. Helios Capital's headquarters was perched high above Manhattan, a palace of glass and quiet money. The elevator opened to a view of the skyline, the city spread out below like a living heartbeat. His office smelled faintly of cedar and control. Miss Carter Pierce said, standing from behind a marble desk that could have doubled as an altar. "I've been waiting 3 years to meet the woman who proved me wrong." He extended his hand. His Rolex caught the light like a promise. 3 years, I said, taking the seat across from him. That's how long it's been since Helios called Nova shares too naive for Wall Street. His smile didn't waver. "And yet here we are? You were right. I was wrong. I'm not too proud to admit it." I didn't believe him. Men like Pierce never admitted defeat. They rebranded it. He leaned forward. "Let's not waste time. Helios wants in. 40% stake in Nova shares. You keep majority control, we provide the infrastructure and access. Asia, Europe, the Middle East. We could make you the next global market leader." He slid a folder across the desk. The paper was heavy, embossed, rich enough to feel like it belonged to someone else's future. 40%, I repeated. "That's generous." "Strategic," he corrected. "Partnerships work best when both parties are properly incentivized. Partnerships or acquisitions." His chuckle was smooth. "You're sharp. I like that." I flipped through the contract. Clauses written in gold and poison. Strategic alignment. Shared governance. Board consultation rights. Every line whispered the same thing, control disguised as collaboration. Pierce rose, walking to the window. "You know, Emily, you're an anomaly in this city. Most people get a seat at the table and never stop talking. You built the table and let everyone else do the talking for you." "That's how I listen," I said. He turned, smiling faintly. "Then listen to this. Helios doesn't just invest in companies. We invest in leaders. The right kind. You could be one of them." There it was, the flattery that bought empires. When I left Helios, the world outside felt louder, cheaper. The city's noise pressed against me, but none of it reached through. At Nova Shares, Claire met me at the elevator, her eyes wide with excitement. "So tell me everything." They made an offer. She squealed. "Helios. That's massive, Emily. Do you realize what this means, global markets? Institutional capital. They could turn us into the Tesla of fintech." "Or the next Icarus," I murmured. She blinked. "What, nothing? Just make sure the legal team reviews the term sheet." I walked into my office, glass walls, simple desk, a single orchid that somehow refused to die. I looked at the Nova Shares logo on the far wall. It gleamed like something earned, not bought. Every success story I'd ever studied had a graveyard behind it, and Helios Capital had buried more companies than I could count. At 7, my phone rang. "Ryan. I heard about Helios." "Holy hell, that's incredible. You heard fast." Dad called. Said Pierce himself reached out to congratulate him. "Look, this is it, sis. You're finally at Dad's level." "I'm not trying to be at his level," I said. "I'm trying to rise above his mistakes." Ryan laughed. "You're always dramatic." "I'm always right," I replied, and hung up. An hour later, Marcus Liu, our legal counsel, walked in. Former Helios man. Cool eyes, quiet voice. I read the draft, he said, setting the folder on my desk. "You shouldn't sign this. Because it's not an investment. It's a blueprint for takeover. That strategic alignment clause gives them power to overrule board votes within 12 months. You'll lose control before you realize you've sold it." I looked at him. "You're sure?" He nodded. "I've seen it happen. They buy people before they buy companies. Why tell me this? He hesitated. Because I've seen what Pierce does to founders like you. They disappear. When he left the room, fell into silence again. The city outside glowed endless and indifferent. I stood by the window holding the contract my reflection caught between two worlds. Nova Shares' light behind me, Helios's shadow before me. Pierce had offered me the world for 40% of my soul. The question wasn't whether I could afford to say no. It was whether I could survive saying yes. The contract from Helios sat on my desk for 3 nights before I opened it again. By then, the city had learned to whisper my name like a rumor, half admiration, half curiosity. Emily Carter, the quiet billionaire. It sounded almost unreal. But in the reflection of my glass office walls, I still looked like the same woman who once took lunch breaks in a janitor's closet because she couldn't stand being mocked in the staff kitchen. I told myself I'd only read the contract one more time just to be sure I was doing the right thing. But I wasn't looking for clarity. I was looking for permission. The first clause read, strategic alignment. It sounded harmless. The words were smooth sterile, like something written by someone who believed in moral gray areas. The deeper I went, the more I realized it wasn't a contract, it was an invitation to surrender. I poured a glass of bourbon. Somewhere outside, the hum of Manhattan wrapped itself around my windows like a reminder this city rewards the bold and buries the hesitant. The phone rang at 10:42 p.m. Jonathan Pierce. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity was my oldest weakness. Still awake, his voice was calm velvet over ice. I don't sleep much these days. Then you'll fit right in with us. A pause. You've read the contract. Twice. And I've read enough to know it's not really a partnership. He chuckled. You think I'd come after you just to own a company? No, Emily. I want to own your momentum. Helios can make it infinite. I leaned back. Infinity sounds expensive. It is, but it's also inevitable. You've outgrown the startup stage. The next phase isn't about innovation, it's about endurance. Global scaling, risk absorption, regulatory protection. Helios has that. You don't. He wasn't wrong. Nova Shares was soaring, but so was the pressure. Every success attracted imitators, lawsuits, expectations. I'd built something unstoppable but fragile. Think about it, Pierce continued. Your platform is changing how people buy shares, how they trust the stock market. Do you really want to stay small when you could shape the entire system? I hesitated. The word shape stayed with me. It hit a nerve. Let me sleep on it, I said finally. Of course, he replied. But don't take too long. Markets don't wait for indecision. When the call ended, I sat in the dark listening to the city breathe. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew he was right about the market, about power. But he was wrong about me. I didn't build Nova Shares to dominate. I built it because no one ever gave me a fair chance. The next morning, I found Marcus waiting in my office. His suit was pressed, his expression tight. I had a contact at the SEC look into Helios, he said. They're under quiet review. Insider trading investigations, shadow subsidiaries, nothing public yet, but smoke that thick means fire's coming. I frowned. Why the sudden warning? He leaned forward. Because I think Pierce is trying to clean his books through you. He needs a spotless company yours to launder his image before it burns. I closed my eyes. The bourbon from last night turned bitter in my throat. Walk away, Emily, Marcus said. You don't need them. But what if I do? I murmured. What if this is what it takes to survive long term? Then you're not surviving, he said quietly. You're selling longevity at the cost of integrity. He left the contract on my desk, one page marked with a yellow tab. I opened it. Clause 12, Executive Advisory Oversight. It gave Helios the right to appoint a board representative to guide strategic alignment. A polite way of saying, we'll run your company while you smile for the cameras. At noon, the boardroom was filled with sunlight and tension. Claire, my COO, stood at the end of the table, trying to sound optimistic. If we sign Helios, could triple our valuation overnight. They're promising access to sovereign funds and institutional portfolios. And when will they decide to steer us off course? Marcus asked. What then? Claire shrugged. We'd still have our shares. Marcus smiled grimly. So did every founder they've ever absorbed. I didn't speak. My gaze stayed fixed on the contract. 40%. It looked small on paper but felt enormous in spirit. Finally, I stood. The meeting's over. Claire blinked. So, we're rejecting? No, I said. We're thinking. Marcus followed me out. Thinking is the first step to losing ground, he said. Maybe, I replied, but silence bought me everything I have. Let's see what it buys next. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone had gone. I looked at the city below its skyline like a pulse made of glass and greed. I thought of Pierce, of his voice smooth as the marble floors in his tower. He offered me the world, and all I had to give up was a signature. I turned off the lights, letting my reflection vanish from the glass. If Helios wanted my silence, they would have to pay more than money. They'd have to risk something they couldn't buy back. And I was about to find out exactly what that price was. By the time the board voted, the city had already decided I'd say yes. Headlines called it the merger of the year. Though I hadn't signed a single page. Reporters camped outside NovaShares' headquarters, cameras waiting for a glimpse of my decision. They didn't understand that silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Inside the boardroom hummed with tension. The contract from Helios lay open at the center of the table, a quiet predator surrounded by glass walls and nervous optimism. Claire paced near the window, phone in hand. Helios just leaked the news, she said. They're pushing the narrative that we're already in. I looked at her. They're trying to corner us. Marcus nodded. Pierce knows the market moves faster than lawyers. If you don't sign soon, you'll look indecisive. Your stock could take a hit. Then let it go, I said. Integrity doesn't have a ticker symbol. Claire stopped pacing. Emily, with all due respect, we built this company to scale. You can't keep playing defense. Helios could take us public in London. Tokyo. Think of the exposure. Exposure. The same word my brother had used when he suggested I let Dad's firm mentor me. The same trap, different packaging. I turned to the window, the skyline reflected in the glass like a chessboard. Pierce doesn't want to scale us, I said. He wants to study us, break us down, copy what works and kill what doesn't. Marcus leaned back. That's what Helios does best. Claire crossed her arms. And yet every company they've acquired is still profitable. For now, I said. But at what cost? The silence that followed was thick, heavy with ambition and fear. I could see it in their eyes, the hunger to be global, the greed dressed up as progress. At 6 that evening, my assistant buzzed through the intercom. Jonathan Pierce is here. I didn't flinch. Send him in. He entered without knocking, the kind of man who assumed every room belonged to him. His suit was dark, flawless, his smile surgical. Miss Carter, he said, taking the seat opposite mine. Have you made a decision? I'm still reading. He smirked. You've had 5 days. I had a lifetime of being underestimated. A few days of caution won't kill me. He folded his hands. You're a rare breed, Emily. Cautious, yet dangerous. But I'll be honest, I don't like waiting. The world doesn't either. Then you'll appreciate this, I said, sliding a document across the desk. A counteroffer. His brow arched. A counteroffer. Helios can take 25%. Advisory rights only. No board interference. No voting privileges. In exchange, we'll open exclusive access to our retail data analytics. He scanned the paper, lips tightening. You're offering less than half of what I proposed. I'm offering control, I said, and protection. For both of us. He laughed softly. You think you can dictate terms to Helios? I met his gaze. I think I already am. The room went still. Behind us, the city flickered with early evening light, skyscrapers catching fire in the sunset. Pierce finally spoke. You know, when we first looked at NovaShares, we thought you were an idealist, someone who believed in fair markets and equal access. But this, he tapped the paper, this is pure strategy. Ruthless. I smiled faintly. You said you invest in leaders, not ideas. Consider this my application. He leaned back, studying me. You're going to be trouble. I've been told that before. He stood, slipping the document into his briefcase. I'll review it. But let me be clear, if we walk away, the market will see hesitation as weakness. Stocks react to perception, not principle. Then they'll learn to value principle, I said, even if it takes a dip first. His eyes darkened, a flicker of respect or warning. Be careful, Emily. Integrity doesn't always pay dividends. It does, I said quietly. Just not in your currency. When he left, the silence felt heavier than before. Claire exhaled. You just risked a billion-dollar partnership. No, I said, closing the folder. I just tested who they really are. Marcus smirked. And if he accepts, then Helios learns how to share power, I said. And if he doesn't, I looked out at the skyline again. Then we build without them. The board adjourned, but I stayed. The sun disappeared behind the buildings, leaving only reflections, shadows of ambition dancing on glass. Power was never the ability to say yes. It was the courage to say no and still stand tall when the world tried to move you. Tomorrow, the markets will react. Tomorrow, the headlines will spin. But tonight, for the first time, I felt unshakable. The contract was still unsigned, and the silence was entirely mine. When the headlines hit, my family treated them like gossip, not history. Carter rejects billion-dollar partnership with Helios Capital. By the time the morning papers reached the suburbs, my brother had already called twice. I ignored the first one. The second came with Mom's voice in the background, tight and disappointed. Emily Ryan said, his tone a mix of superiority and concern. What the hell are you doing? Do you know what people are saying about you? Yes, I said calmly, stirring my coffee. I've read it. You turned down Helios. Do you even realize how insane that looks? You could have secured our family name for generations. Instead, you're running my company the way I built it. I cut in. He scoffed. You think independence will keep you rich? Wake up. You don't fight Wall Street. You join it. That's what Dad's been saying. Dad built an empire on debt and influence. I built one on data and truth. There's a difference. A pause. Then softer, you've changed. Good, I said, and hung up. Later that evening, I arrived at our parents' estate for dinner, a formality I couldn't avoid. The same mansion where I'd once been told to smile and stay quiet during investor meetings. Tonight, though, I was the story. The dining hall gleamed under chandeliers, just like that night months ago when Ryan mocked my tiny job. Except this time, no one laughed. Dad sat at the head of the table, his silver hair slicked back, his expression somewhere between pride and calculation. Mom poured wine like it was a peace offering. Emily, Dad said. Helios called me. Of course they had. They're disappointed, he continued. Jonathan Pierce says you're making emotional decisions. That's not how CEOs survive. Funny, I said, because that's exactly what he said before trying to buy me out. Mom sighed. Sweetheart, sometimes compromise isn't weakness, it's strategy. Selling control isn't a strategy, I said. It's surrender. Ryan leaned forward. You've always had a martyr complex. You think standing alone makes you stronger, but it just makes you an easier target. His fiancée Clara smirked, swirling her wine. It's cute, though. The whole independent woman against the world vibe. I mean, it is trending. My fork froze midway. The room went still. I smiled tightly. You should probably keep up with trends, Clara. Because tomorrow, when NovaShares announces our new partnership with Horizon Group, you'll want to say you knew about it first. Ryan frowned. Horizon, the European fund. They reached out after Helios leaked our rejection, I said. They offered a clean deal, 15% equity, no governance interference, global expansion guaranteed. Dad's eyes narrowed. And you didn't tell us, I set my glass down. Since when have you been on my board? Ryan muttered. You're bluffing. I opened my phone and slid it across the table. The Bloomberg article was already live. NovaShares secures Horizon Group partnership, valuation surges 18%. Overnight. Ryan's face fell. Clara blinked. Dad leaned back slowly, his fingers steepled. "You really did it," he murmured. "You outplayed Helios." I looked at him. "No, Dad. I just stopped playing by their rules." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was stunned. For the first time, my father didn't sound like a CEO talking to his child. He sounded like a man realizing his daughter had outgrown him. Mom finally broke the tension. "Well, congratulations, darling. We're proud of you." Her smile was genuine. Ryan's wasn't. As we moved to dessert, he couldn't help himself. "You still think you're untouchable, don't you?" "I don't need to be untouchable," I said softly. "Just unshakable." He laughed bitterly. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said, looking him in the eye. "It makes me free." He slammed his napkin down. "You always loved playing the victim, Em. Don't act like your success doesn't depend on this family name." I leaned forward. "Ryan, you once laughed at my tiny job. Now your firm is trying to buy into it. Maybe the family name depends on me." His face flushed red. Dad raised a hand before another word could land. "Enough." The conversation died there, but the war didn't. When I left that night, the air outside smelled like rain and victory. My phone buzzed, Pierce's name glowing across the screen. I didn't answer. The next morning, Nova shares stock rose 22%. Headlines read, "Carter defies Wall Street, wins anyway." I didn't smile when I saw it. I just closed the paper and whispered, they should have known better than to bet against silence. But deep down, I knew the silence wouldn't last. Not in my family, not on Wall Street, and definitely not with Jonathan Pierce still watching. The morning after the Horizon deal went public, my family group chat exploded. Ryan sent a single message first. "You think this is over?" "It's not." I didn't reply. I'd learned long ago that silence burns hotter than any argument. By noon, my mother called. Her tone was sweet but strategic, the kind she used when trying to negotiate peace before Dad got involved. "Emily, darling, your father wants you to come by the house. Just for a quick lunch." "No business talk," he promised. "Lunch or ambush?" I asked. She hesitated. "He's proud of you. He just doesn't like surprises." Neither did I, especially the kind that came wrapped in crystal glassware and fake smiles. When I arrived at the Carter estate, the staff looked at me differently, no longer the quiet daughter in the background, but the name the newspapers couldn't stop printing. Dad was already in the study papers spread across his desk, the same desk I'd once dusted as a teenager, because he said it built discipline. "Emily," he said, not looking up, "you've made quite the impression." I didn't realize saying no was so revolutionary. He smirked. "It's not the no, it's how loud it sounded. You embarrassed Helios. That's not good for the family brand." "Funny," I said. "When Ryan humiliated me in front of 200 guests, that didn't seem to bother anyone's brand." He finally looked up, his blue-gray eyes colder than the marble beneath my heels. "You're not here to settle old scores. You're here because I'm offering you a seat at the Carter Group." I froze. "What?" He stood walking around the desk like a man who knew he still controlled the room. "You've proven yourself. The board likes your initiative. We need someone like you, visionary modern. Join us, and I'll make you Executive Director of Innovation." My stomach twisted. The Carter Group, the same corporation that had shut me out years ago because I was too emotional for finance. "You mean you want to own part of Nova shares?" I said. His jaw tightened. "I'm offering to bring you back into the fold. You've done well, but success built on rebellion doesn't last. Helios will come for you again, and Horizon won't protect you when it gets messy. But we will." There it was, the offer disguised as rescue. "I don't need protection, Dad. You need a legacy," he shot back. "The Carter name opened doors for you. Don't pretend otherwise." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Dad. It closed them. I opened my own." Ryan's voice came from the doorway. "Wow. Still the same ungrateful little sister." He stepped in, his smile sharp. "Do you know how many CEOs would kill for that offer?" "Maybe they should take it," I said. It sounds more like a leash than an opportunity. He crossed his arms. You're arrogant, Em. Always have been. You think running a tech company makes you untouchable. The market eats people like you alive. I turned to him. At least I feed myself. How's Dad's firm treating you these days? Still signing your name under his? His nostrils flared. But before he could answer, Dad slammed his hand on the desk. Enough. This is family, not a battlefield. I took a breath, steadying the anger crawling up my throat. Family stops being family when loyalty becomes currency. Mom appeared at the door, her eyes wet. Voice trembling. Please, can we stop? Just one meal without turning everything into a war, but it already was a war. Not one fought with weapons, but with names, shares, and the ghosts of who we used to be. Dad finally sighed. Think about it, Emily. You can't stand alone forever. I nodded slowly. Maybe not. But at least when I fall, I'll know it was my own decision. I left before dessert. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that wakes you up and reminds you what freedom costs. My phone buzzed a message from Marcus. Pierce just bought into Horizon Group's parent company. He's coming back around. I stared at the screen, feeling the world tilt slightly under me. Helios wasn't gone. It was circling. And this time it was coming through the back door with my family holding it open. I slipped my phone into my coat pocket, the old Carter estate fading behind me like a chapter I'd already outgrown. Let them build their legacy. I was busy protecting mine. The first sign that something was wrong came from the numbers. Not the headlines, not the meetings, just the quiet, invisible math beneath them. It was late, close to midnight, and I was reviewing the quarterly reports. The figures looked clean, almost too clean. No variances, no fluctuations, no irregularities. The kind of perfection that only happens when someone's hiding something. I leaned back in my chair, the city's skyline glowing through my office window. A voice from the past echoed in my head. My old accounting mentor, Mr. Greer. When numbers are flawless, someone's lying. The next morning I called Marcus into my office. He shut the door behind him, sensing something heavy in the air. Look at this, I said, turning my laptop toward him. Nova Shares Analytics Division. The numbers don't make sense. It's like someone's smoothing volatility manually. He scrolled through the data. His jaw tightened. They're ghost editing reports. But who has clearance? I already knew the answer before he asked. Horizon Group. 3 weeks earlier, I'd given them limited access to our global data system, just enough to review shared integrations. But someone at Horizon had found a way past the firewall. Pull every internal log from the last 10 days, I said. And Marcus, don't tell anyone else, especially Claire. He hesitated. You think she's involved? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Claire had been the one who vouched for Horizon, the one who'd called them a perfect partner. By the next day, Marcus returned with a folder. It's confirmed. Horizon's back-end team has been copying transaction data into a shadow database. Same architecture as Helios's network. My pulse slowed. Helios. He nodded grimly. They're working together. I stood pacing toward the window. Manhattan looked endless, beautiful, merciless, alive. They didn't come through the front door this time, I said. They came through the walls. Marcus folded his arms. They're planning a silent takeover. Pierce couldn't buy you directly, so he's using Horizon as a proxy. Once they control your infrastructure, they'll control your stock price. I turned back to him. Not if I burn the bridge first. His eyebrows shot up. Emily, if you pull Horizon's access now, they'll retaliate. The markets will tank. Then let them. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched every chart, every percentage, every pulse of the company I had built from nothing. My empire wasn't numbers. It was belief. Belief that I could rewrite the story my family had told me about power. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. Claire walked in, late, eyes red from stress or guilt, I couldn't tell. Everyone's talking about the dip in our shares, she said breathlessly. What's going on? I clicked the remote, projecting the data on the screen. The graphs showed the truth in neon red. This, I said, is what's going on. Whispers filled the room. Board members exchanged glances. confusion rippling like static. Horizon Group has been siphoning data to Helios. I continued. This isn't partnership, it's theft. Claire's face went pale. That's impossible. I personally verified. You personally vouched for them, I interrupted. And now we're compromised. One of the directors, an older man named Stein, leaned forward. Emily, if this goes public, investors will flee. Then we don't let it go public, I said. We control the narrative. We'll announce a strategic audit of all external systems and suspend Horizon's access immediately. Claire stood abruptly. You can't just cut them off. I already did, I said. 30 minutes ago. The room erupted in chaos. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, and somewhere in the middle of it all I saw fear. Not just from them, but from Claire. After the meeting, she followed me into the hallway. Emily, please. You don't understand. Pierce promised Horizon would never interfere. Pierce promised a lot of things, I said coldly. That's how he wins. He convinces good people to do bad things for the sake of ambition. Tears welled in her eyes. I was trying to protect the company. I stared at her. No, you were trying to protect your career. I walked away before she could answer. By nightfall, Nova Shares' internal systems were sealed. Horizon's access terminated. The markets panicked, shares dipped, headlines screamed. But beneath the noise, something stronger began to build trust. Investors respected truth more than polish. Within 48 hours, our stock stabilized. Within 72, it climbed. Marcus sent me a single message that night. You turned a sabotage into a statement. I looked out the window, the city shimmering like a boardroom of stars. Helios thought they could control my story. They forgot who wrote the script, and for the first time in weeks I smiled, because this time I wasn't defending my empire. I was preparing for war. The day after Horizon fell, the office felt electric like the air before a thunderstorm. People whispered in corners, emails stopped mid-sentence, and every set of eyes that passed mine seemed to ask the same question, what now? I didn't have an answer yet. But I had a plan. Marcus was already in my office when I arrived. The blinds were drawn, the lights dim. He'd printed documents, hundreds of them spread across my desk, like the aftermath of a quiet explosion. Helios moved, he said without preamble. They just filed for regulatory review with the SEC, accusing Nova Shares of violating data privacy laws. I froze. They're turning the sabotage into a scandal. He nodded grimly. Pierce doesn't fight in public. He destroys reputations before anyone sees the smoke. I leaned over the papers. How solid is his case? Fabricated, Marcus said. But convincing. He's got emails, timestamps, even financial transfers that make it look like we were the ones funneling data. Claire. It had to be her. Whether willingly or not, she'd given him access. Can we counter it? I asked. He hesitated. Legally, yes. Publicly, not without taking damage. I walked to the window, watching the morning sun break over the skyline. Manhattan glittered like it didn't care who bled beneath it. Then we make noise louder than his lies, I said. Call a press conference for noon. Marcus blinked. Emily, that's suicide. You'll be walking into his narrative. Good, I said. Then I'll rewrite it while he's still watching. By 11, the top floor of Nova Shares looked like a war zone disguised as corporate calm. PR teams rehearsed statements, legal advisors whispered legalese like prayer. And my assistant placed a single cup of black coffee beside me. No sugar, no cream, just focus. At exactly noon, I stepped onto the stage in front of 24 cameras and enough reporters to fill 3 newspapers' worth of gossip columns. Flashbulbs popped. Questions flew. I waited for silence. Helios Capital, I began, has accused Nova Shares of misconduct. It's a bold accusation considering they're the ones who financed the very system that breached our data. Murmurs spread. Some reporters exchanged glances. I let the tension build. I'm not here to deny what happened, I continued. I'm here to tell the truth. We discovered unauthorized data activity traced back to Horizon Group, a company secretly controlled by Helios through offshore intermediaries. We've submitted evidence to the SEC this morning. More murmurs, louder this time. Cameras zoomed in. Someone from the back shouted, "Do you have proof?" Marcus stepped forward, handing me a folder. "Right here." I opened it slowly, deliberately. These documents show financial transfers between Helios shell accounts and Horizon's board. They also show the fake transactions Pierce is now using to accuse us. The real data trail leads straight to him. Reporters shouted over each other, now voices overlapping in chaos. I raised a hand, letting the noise crest and fall. For years, companies like Helios have hidden behind influence and intimidation. They assume founders like me will break under pressure. I look straight into the camera lens. They assume wrong. The flash of lights nearly blinded me, but I held my ground. When I stepped off the stage, Marcus met me with a nod. That was a declaration of war. "No," I said quietly. "That was the first shot." By evening, every financial network was replaying the footage. Some called it brave, others called it reckless, but everyone called it news. Then my phone rang. "Unknown number." "Miss Carter," the voice said smoothly. "Jonathan Pierce. I wondered when you'd call." I'll admit he said you surprised me. Most people crumble when I come for them. I'm not most people. True, but even you can't outlast a storm this big. The SEC moves slowly, but investors move faster. Stocks fall on fear, not facts. Then I'll give them something stronger than fear. He chuckled softly. "You can't win this, Emily. You might win the interview, the headline, the sympathy. But in the long game, Helios always wins." I smiled into the silence. Then maybe it's time someone changed the game. I hung up before he could reply. That night, Nova Shares' stock dipped 10%. By morning, it rose 5 degrees. The market didn't know what to believe yet, but they were watching. And that meant the next move had to be perfect. As I stared at the city lights from my office, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a corporate battle anymore. It was personal. Pierce wanted to ruin me publicly. I was going to dismantle him quietly, one share, one lie, one truth at a time. The week after the press conference, everything moved faster than I could breathe. Investors called nonstop. Journalists begged for exclusives. Horizon collapsed publicly, and Helios denied everything. On paper, it looked like a draw. In reality, the game had shifted. The SEC subpoenaed both companies for records. That was my opening. I didn't need to destroy Pierce in court. I just needed the truth to surface while he was still pretending to be clean. But truth has a price. It started with Claire. She walked into my office one morning with eyes red from crying, holding an envelope. "They offered me immunity," she said quietly. "Immunity?" I asked, setting down my coffee. She nodded. "Helios's lawyers. They want me to testify that you knew about the data breach." The silence between us was sharp enough to cut. "And did you agree?" She hesitated. "They said if I don't, they'll come after me too." "I don't have your resources, Emily. I can't fight them." For the first time, I saw not betrayal, but exhaustion. Claire wasn't a villain. She was collateral. "Take the deal," I said finally. Her head snapped up. "What? Take it. Testify. Tell the truth, that you trusted Horizon, that you didn't know Helios was behind it. I'll handle the rest." Tears welled in her eyes. "You'll be crucified." "Maybe. But I'll still own my name." She left without another word. That night I sat in the darkened office alone except for the quiet hum of the server room. On my desk was a photo Ryan, Dad, Mom, and me from years ago. I remembered that day. Thanksgiving. The last time I'd felt like family meant something more than strategy. Now even my own was part of the war. At midnight, Marcus arrived with 2 cups of coffee and a file labeled Helios Internal. "I found something," he said. "An internal memo. Pierce authorized Horizon's buy-in using capital from an unregistered fund. Offshore. That's a federal violation." I looked up at him. "How did you get this?" "Let's just say I know someone who still owes me a favor from my Helios days." I skimmed the memo. One line stood out: "Projected acquisition of Nova shares through indirect share dilution." "Share dilution," I murmured. "That's how they plan to take control without buying us." Marcus nodded. They were using shell investors to quietly buy NovaShares stock in bulk. On paper, it looks random, but every purchase traces back to the same offshore entity. I exhaled slowly. So that's the game. He looked at me. Emily, if we expose this, it's over for Pierce. But it'll also drag the company into chaos. Investors hate uncertainty. I don't care, I said. He turned honesty into a weapon. I'm just returning it to its rightful owner. By dawn, we had everything ready. Record statements, screenshots, wire transfers. I didn't trust any PR firm with it. This was personal. I sent the file directly to the SEC and one to the Wall Street Journal. At 9, the story broke. Helios Capital accused of manipulating stock through offshore funds. The fallout was instant. Pierce's empire began to crack its polished surface, fracturing under the weight of investigation. Helios stock plummeted 12% in hours. By noon, my phone rang again. Pierce, you just cost your company millions, he said, voice trembling with restrained fury. No, I replied. I saved it. You think this makes you a hero? I don't care about being a hero. I care about being honest. He laughed, bitter and hollow. Honesty doesn't build empires. Maybe not, I said softly. But it ends them. For a moment there was silence, real heavy silence. Then he hung up. I closed my eyes, letting the adrenaline drain from my body. Marcus stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. You did it. Not yet, I said. But the noise is starting. Outside, camera crews gathered again. My staff buzzed with both fear and awe. I walked past them, calm, collected, every step deliberate. Because I finally understood what power really was. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't even a victory. It was the ability to tell the truth and survive the silence that followed. That night, the city below looked different. The lights weren't just reflections anymore. They were reminders, each one a flicker of someone who'd underestimated me. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned off the phone, and whispered to no one in particular. You wanted to play with stocks, Pierce? You forgot I owned the table. The morning after the Helios scandal broke, Wall Street smelled blood. Financial analysts called it the fall of a giant, and for once they were right. Pierce's empire had cracked wide open, its power leaking through every headline and legal filing. NovaShares' stock surged by 12% before noon. For the first time in months, I wasn't playing defense, I was the storm. But winning doesn't feel like you expect it to. It's quieter, lonelier. When the dust clears, you don't feel triumphant. You feel emptied. Marcus found me staring out my office window, watching the trading tickers dance across the skyline. You should celebrate, he said. Helios is finished. Not yet, I replied. Pierce still has one card left the public. He frowned. You think he'll go after your reputation? I know he will, I said. And he'll do it through someone he knows I won't fight back against. That afternoon, my phone rang. Mom. Emily, she said softly. Your father's not well. He's been getting calls. People saying your name's tied up in fraud. Ryan's trying to fix it. Ryan's helping him, I asked, my chest tightening. He says you pushed too hard. Made enemies. Maybe if you came home and explained what I snapped. That I refused to sell myself to men like Pierce. That I built something they couldn't control. Emily, please, she whispered. This family's reputation. Mom, I said, cutting her off. Our family's reputation has been built on pretending. I stopped pretending. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't calling to warn me. She was calling to ask me to surrender. That evening, Pierce went on national television. His voice was calm, rehearsed his tie the color of deception. Helios Capital, he said, has always operated with integrity. Unfortunately, NovaShares and its CEO, Emily Carter, engaged in irregular data practices that forced us to sever ties. We regret that trust was misplaced. The anchor nodded solemnly. The segment aired on every major network within the hour. By nightfall, social media had turned. Hashtags bloomed like weeds. Carter scandal, data fraud, fallen CEO. Ryan called at midnight. His tone was smug beneath the concern. You should have listened to Dad. This is bigger than you. No, Ryan, I said, my voice cold. It's exactly my size. He hesitated. You're going to lose everything if you keep this up. Then I'll rebuild it, I said, like I always do. The next morning I walked into the office to find Marcus waiting. He was holding a flash drive. Remember the internal audit we ran on Helios's offshore accounts? Yes. Well, he said, a small smile forming. Turns out Pierce paid Ryan $200,000 last month. Consulting fees. From a Helios subsidiary. I froze. My brother Marcus nodded. He helped Pierce gain access to Carter Group's internal investors. That's how Helios kept its claws in your family's company. It took me a moment to breathe again. Betrayal shouldn't surprise me anymore, but it still did. Marcus placed the drive in my hand. You could bury him with this, or you could do what you always do, outsmart them instead. I looked at the tiny silver device, its weight heavier than gold. What happens if I expose this? The Carter legacy collapses, he said. But so does Pierce's. I walked to the window. Below me, the city pulsed with indifference, streets filled with ambition lights shaped like temptation. I don't want to destroy my family, I said quietly. I just want them to stop destroying me. Then show them what survival really looks like, Marcus said. That night I did. At precisely 8 p.m., I posted a video statement, not polished, not corporate, just real. My office lights dim behind me, my tone calm, deliberate. I built Nova Shares with one goal: to give people control over their own investments. What I didn't expect was that my biggest battle wouldn't be with markets, but with manipulation. I've been attacked, sabotaged, and lied about. But the numbers don't lie. The truth doesn't disappear just because powerful men say it should. I paused, letting the silence breathe. As of tonight, all documentation regarding Helios's offshore fraud and their network of internal accomplices, including within my own family, has been turned over to federal authorities. I will not apologize for defending what I built. Integrity isn't a strategy, it's the standard. The video went viral within hours. By morning, the Wall Street Journal ran a new headline: Helios founder under federal investigation. Carter family link revealed. Ryan tried to call. I didn't answer. Dad sent a single text: we need to talk. But for once, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. As the city woke beneath me, I realized I'd won, not because I destroyed them, but because I refused to play their game anymore. The tables hadn't just turned. I'd built a new table, and I was the only one with a seat at it. 3 months after the scandal, the storm finally broke. Helios collapsed under federal investigation. Pierce resigned in disgrace, and Nova Shares stood untouched, bruised but unbroken. The markets called it a miracle recovery. I called it survival. The press wanted an interview. The board wanted celebration, and my investors wanted reassurance. But all I wanted was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't echo with adrenaline or fear, just peace. On a gray November morning, I took the train to Connecticut, back to my parents' estate. The air smelled like wet leaves and memory. It was Thanksgiving, the first family dinner since everything fell apart. When I stepped through the front door, the silence was thick. Ryan was already there, standing by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Dad sat in his old armchair, a cane resting beside him, the years suddenly catching up to him. Mom was in the kitchen, pretending the smell of roasted turkey could fix the air between us. Emily, Dad said finally. You came. I said I would, I replied. Ryan's eyes darted away from mine. The feds came by the office last week, he muttered, asked questions about Helios. I nodded. I know. He looked up sharply. You gave them my name. No, I said softly. You gave them yours when you took the money. He flinched. You ruined me. I took a breath. No, Ryan. You did that yourself. I just stopped protecting you from the truth. He turned away, shoulders rigid. Dad's gaze lingered on me, heavy with something between anger and regret. Do you know what this has done to our name? Yes, I said. It made it honest. The room went silent again, the kind of silence that used to make me small. But this time it didn't. It fit me. Mom entered, then her voice soft but trembling. "Please sit down. It's Thanksgiving. For one night, can we just be a family?" We sat. The meal was quiet, awkward, filled with clinking silverware and unsaid things. The house felt smaller somehow, like the walls themselves had stopped pretending. Halfway through dinner, Dad cleared his throat. "Your mother and I watched your interview," he said. "The one about integrity." I waited. He hesitated. "You were right to fight back. I didn't see that before. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get, and maybe that was enough." After dessert, I walked outside. The night was cold, the stars sharp against the dark sky. My breath curled in the air like smoke. I'd spent years chasing power, then months surviving it. And now, for the first time, I understood what it really meant, not control, not dominance, but freedom. Behind me, the door creaked open. Ryan stepped out, hands shoved in his pockets. He looked smaller than I remembered. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said quietly. "I know." He swallowed hard. "You were always the strong one. I just didn't want to feel like I was losing." "We both lost," I said. "We just lost different things." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe one day we'll fix it." "Maybe," I said, and meant it. When I returned to the city the next morning, the skyline looked softer, less like a battlefield and more like a horizon. Nova Shares had become more than a company. It was a symbol of what could be rebuilt after betrayal. Marcus met me at the office with 2 coffees and a grin. "You're officially the most searched CEO on Wall Street." "Good or bad?" I asked. 50-50? "Perfect," I said. "That means they're still paying attention." He laughed, setting the coffee down. "So what's next for Emily Carter?" I looked out at the city, the hum of traffic below like the heartbeat of something alive. "I think I'll finally do what I built this company for," I said. "Help others protect themselves before they ever have to fight." He smiled. "Teaching them how to win." "No," I said, turning toward him. "Teaching them how not to lose themselves trying." Later that night, I stayed in the office long after everyone had gone. The glass walls reflected the lights of Manhattan, bright, restless, endless. I thought of every person who doubted me, every voice that told me to stay small. And I thought of the woman who'd walked into that luxury dinner months ago, humiliated and silent. She was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about reclamation. I turned off the lights, watching my reflection fade into the skyline. To the family, I whispered, and to finally being free. Then I smiled. Because for the first time, the silence felt like victory. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone who's ever been underestimated that silence can be power too. And if you want to hear more stories of women who turn betrayal into strength, subscribe. The next one might just be yours.